All right, so this lesson is going to be on square root functions, and you probably already know square root functions by now, but the definition of it is you take the square root of something, it's the opposite of when you square. So here we have x squared. If you take the square root of it, you would get x. So if you were taking the square root of some number, you would be looking for a number. You would be looking for one number where if you square it, you will get that number that you took the square root of it is. So if you were finding the square root of 4, you would be looking for a number that if you multiply it by itself, you'll get 4. So in that case, because that's an easy one, it would just be 2, because 2 times 2 equals 4. So the square root of 4 would be 2. Another way to write square root, as you can see square root of x right here, is x to the half power. Again, this is the inverse of squaring it, so if you want to think of it that way, instead of x to the 2, it's x to the 1 over 2 is the inverse of that. So you might see it written this way, x to the half power for the square root. All right, if you have a number x that's greater than 0, it would be considered positive. You probably know that. It's pretty easy to understand that. So x is greater than 0, that would be a positive number. And if you square x, you will always get a number that's greater than 0. So say you have a positive number like 2, if you square it, you get 4. If you have a positive number like 3, you square it, you get 9. So anytime you square a positive number, you'll get a positive number, because a positive times a positive is a positive. If you have a number that's less than 0, so that means it would be negative. Here I wrote x is less than 0. So if you have a number that's negative and you square it, so I'm going to do the same thing I did here where I squared the x, you'll also get a number that's positive. So even though x is negative here, because you squared it, it becomes positive, because a negative times a negative is also a positive, just in the same case as a positive times a positive is a positive. So it's really important to understand. You will never get a number for x, whether it's greater than 0 or less than 0, to be less than 0. It's impossible to square a number and get a negative out of it. Because it's impossible, mathematicians basically invented another set of numbers where it is possible, and this is called imaginary numbers. And the imaginary unit, this I, that's what's called imaginary unit, is equal to the square root of -1. So if you want to kind of think of it as, if you had with real numbers, the number that all other numbers are based off of is 1, because any number times 1 is that same number. But for imaginary numbers, it's any imaginary number is divisible by I, right here, this imaginary unit. So this is almost like the 1 in the imaginary number line. So you have a real number line, all the numbers are based off 1. For the imaginary number line, all the numbers are based on this I imaginary unit right here. And it's equal to the square root of -1, because again, you can't take the square root of a negative number, so we have to give it a different set of numbers. So it's called imaginary numbers. If you square I, as you can see right here, you end up getting -1. So if you square this side and you square this side, it gets rid of the square root, and you end up with just -1 here. All right, so we're going to do a little example here, but rather than actually give you a number, I'm going to make you guys use the numbers in the assignments that we're going to be doing in class, but I'm just going to give you a variable. So say this variable is n, and it's less than 0. So it means it's a negative number. This n right here is a negative number. So if you want, just think of any negative number in your head if you need a concrete example. And I'm going to take the square root of that n. Now remember, you can't really take the square root of a negative number unless you use imaginary numbers to define it. So as you can see, we took the square root of a negative number n right here, and it's equal to I, this imaginary unit, and basically what it does is it pulls out the negative from this square root. So this square root, the negative's in here, but I took that out and put it outside here as an I. And I made whatever's in here, this I, the absolute value. So that means it's positive. So right here it says n is less than 0, but if I take the absolute value of n, now it's positive. So what's in here now is a positive number because of this absolute value sign right here. And that would be your answer. So if you want to think of a concrete example like, say n is equal to -4, because -4 is less than 0, so it still follows our rule. The square root of -4 would be I times the square root of 4. Because the absolute value of -4 is 4. So I times the square root of 4 would be I times 2, or 2I in this case. So I kind of gave you a little example verbally there, but for now I'm just going to keep it abstract with the writing just to make you do a little bit of the thinking. All right, and now if you look back at our graph here, the function is f of x equals the square root of x. If you notice, it only stays positive. So any input that's positive or 0, in this case 0 is right here at the origin, it would be 0, 0. Any positive number actually has a value. as you can see right here. But right as soon as it turns negative, right down here, it just disappears, because this is a real number line. This X and Y axis right here represent real numbers. So because these are imaginary numbers, when you take the square root of a negative number, the numbers don't exist on this number line. You actually need a different number line that we're not actually going to be covering in this class, but just so you know, it does actually exist. So hopefully that helps you understand square roots and imaginary numbers a little bit. Let me know if you have any questions.